Hello and welcome to this week's West Asia Post with me, Ghadi Francis, our weekly show where we bring you stories from the world's most volatile region. A very happy, blessed new year to all of our viewers. As we step into 2021, the last year was a monumental one for West Asia. So in this week's episode, we bring you a highlight of everything that happened in 2020 in West Asia and the consequences it holds for this year. We start with the killing of Qassem Soleimani. The death of the Iranian general rocked the region, and things have not been the same ever since.
January 3rd, 2020. An airstrike takes place near the Baghdad International Airport. The attack, ordered by the United States, kills several Iranian and Iraqi military officials, including top military general Qassem Suleimani. The brazen manner of the attack, the drone strike near the cargo area, and a tweet by the US president with the American flag on it. Everything about this killing was extraordinary. And Iran-US relations have never been the same ever since. One of Iran's most powerful men, Soleimani's killing took the region by storm. The silver-haired general was a cult figure in Iran. Right after his death, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei declared him a martyr. Millions took to the streets of the country, mourning their beloved leader. Khamenei himself was seen in tears at his funeral. And not just Iran, there were marches in memory of Soleimani across West Asia. In neighboring Iraq, Syria, Lebanon and Yemen. Iran called this an act of international terrorism and vowed revenge for the killing. For Iran, Soleimani was their hero. The 62-year-old headed the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, an elite unit that handled Iran's overseas operations. Rising to prominence during the country's Islamic Revolution, Soleimani soon became an indispensable figure in Iran. He commandeered militias in neighboring countries. Under his leadership, Iran bolstered the Hezbollah in Lebanon, expanded its military presence in Iraq and Syria, and spread Iran's influence across West Asia. This made Soleimani the second most powerful figure in Iran, only after Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Conflicts in the region gave him the opportunity to expand influence, and the top military commander did just that. He wielded several powerful militias and proxies, many of which have been designated as terrorist organizations. This is where the United States comes in. For the US, Soleimani was a terrorist, one responsible for the deaths of millions. The US blamed Soleimani for the deaths of several American personnel. After his killing, the State Department said, Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region, unquote. Days later, Iran attacked US soldiers in Iraq. While the United States maintains that no one was killed, several soldiers are said to have suffered traumatic brain injuries. Either way, Iran's response has been highly muted. As for the Quds Force, under new leadership, it is no longer a popular mobilization force. Organizational changes may have impacted that to some extent, but it still remains a dominant force in the region. Meanwhile, Iran continues to play up Soleimani's assassination, his martyrdom mentioned by the country's media frequently.
In the next few days, the rule of the savage murderer who committed many crimes will be over, and his life and history will be left in the trash. And we are happy that the Trump's era is over before the anniversary of Soleimani's martyrdom.
The general was a part of the Islamic Republic's projection of power. He held an almost mythical status in the country, crucial to the image of a powerful Iran, one that covered up the reality of a troubled country. And it looks like, even after a year, Iran has no replacement for him. West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
Even as we look back at 2020, we will continue to bring you all the latest updates from West Asia. Here's a look at what's making headlines in this new year in the region.
Iran launches human trials of its first domestic COVID-19 vaccine candidate. Tehran says it could help the country defeat the pandemic despite US sanctions. More than 27,000 Iranians have volunteered to participate in the human trial so far. Saudi court sentences a prominent women's rights activist Loujain al-Hathloul to 5 years and 8 months in prison. The activist has been held since 2018. She was convicted for participating in alleged terrorism-related activities. The United Nations has called for the early release of the women's rights activist. Iran issues a warning to Israel not to cross its red lines in the Gulf. This after reports emerged that Israel has deployed a submarine in the Gulf region. Iran also says it will defend itself against any American military adventure in the run-up to the January 20th handover of power in Washington. Lebanon's Hezbollah says that the group now has twice as many precision-guided missiles as it had a year ago. In an interview, Hassan Nasrallah claims that there was a Saudi-Israel plot to kill him, and that his group has the capability to strike anywhere in Israel and occupied Palestinian territories. Several people have been killed and dozens more wounded in an attack on Yemen's Aden airport. This comes shortly after a plane carrying a newly formed government for Yemen arrived from Saudi Arabia. The cabinet members, including the Yemeni Prime Minister, were transferred safely to the city's presidential palace.
A massive blast. Over 200 people killed. A nation in severe political and economic crisis. The Beirut port blast was an eye-opener for many. The powerful explosion damaged large parts of Beirut. The country is still recovering from its impact. Let's take a look.
4th of August 2020, a warehouse in Beirut caught fire. Then, when it ripped through the building, this happened. A huge mushroom cloud engulfed the skies. The massive explosion rang through the city. Shock waves were felt miles away. The fire detonated 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate, a highly explosive material stored in the port. In moments, the city resembled a war zone. Over 200 people were killed. At least 5,000 were injured. Chaos and confusion gripped the streets. It's a day that Beirut will never forget. For Lebanon, however, it was just another catastrophe. Long before the explosion, the economy was in deep crisis. People had lost faith in the political elite, and people took to the streets. Over and over again. But even after 4 months, Lebanon's blast victims await answers. One question continues to haunt them. Why did no one warn residents or evacuate them, especially when the fire raged close to a huge store of ammonium nitrate?
But they knew they had 40 minutes to tell us, leave Beirut, go hide, get away from the windows. They didn't do it. And they had 40 minutes to prepare for the post-blast, to prepare the hospitals, to open the roads, to send, doctors, the army. They didn't do it.
Lebanese leaders promised a thorough investigation into it. But more than 4 months later, nothing concrete has emerged out of the investigation. Why were 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate stored at the port? And why did no one decide to evacuate it for 6 years? For some, this was the result of Lebanon's flawed political system, one that has led the country from one crisis to another. For others, corruption permeates all levels of society. Almost immediately after the blast, the Lebanese government resigned. But since then, politicians have failed to form a new one. They continue to bicker over who gets what position.
Out of respect for the victims, those at the top should have resigned and gone home. But they can't. They are still dividing up the pie. They still haven't had enough.
Recently, Lebanon's caretaker PM was charged over the blast. Hassan Diab and 3 other ministers were charged with criminal neglect. These are the most high-profile indictments in the investigation. But as they continue to deny the charges, Lebanese citizens feel betrayed. As the world rings in a new year, it looks like stability and justice remains a distant dream for Beirut's victims. West Asia Bureau, WION. World is One.
The winds of change are blowing in West Asia. It started with the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration helped broker a peace deal between the UAE and Israel. Soon after, 4 countries joined, signing normalization deals with Israel. Speculations say that Saudi Arabia will be next in line. In our next report, we decode what this will mean for the future of Palestinians and West Asia.
It was almost 30 years ago that Israel established relations with an Arab neighbor. But this year, winds of change are blowing again in West Asia. Israel has made new friends, and Arab ones at that: the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, the Sudan, and Morocco. The South Lawn of the White House witnessed a historic event in 2020, the signing of the Abraham Accords, brokered by America.
We're here this afternoon to change the course of history. After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East.
The peace deal marks the new dawn of a new West Asia. For decades, the Arabs and Jews have been enemies. The Arab world boycotted Israel and backed Palestine. They insisted on a solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict before they recognized Israel as a country. That dispute is far from settled. But the peace deals signify a new West Asia.
This peace will eventually expand to include other Arab states, and ultimately it can end the Arab-Israeli conflict once and for all.
For Trump, it is a foreign policy win like no other. He accomplished what his predecessors promised and tried, but for Palestinians, this was a huge betrayal. Even though the Abraham Accord puts the annexation plan on hold, the peace deals does not have much for them. They are accusing the Arab states of abandoning them. As for who will join the deal next, all eyes remain on Saudi Arabia. Reports of a secret meeting raised further doubts. If Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu indeed met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, it would have been a historic first for the region. The enmity between the Jewish state and the Arab world has been long. Israel fought multiple wars with its neighbors between 1948 and 1973. It has since engaged in continued conflict with many Arab states. For years, Saudi Arabia has settled on one position. Settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a precondition for normalizing ties. This is a stance that carries great weight in the Arab world. But over the years, the kingdom's position has seen a shift. This shift was spearheaded by the country's maverick Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The Israel move could, however, be his biggest test so far, and Saudi Arabia seems to be in no hurry. Any normalization efforts will not be without a backlash, and it is likely to reignite criticism amid Palestinians. West Asia could witness more peace deals in the new year, but the question remains, will it bring peace to the region? West Asia Bureau, WION, World is One.
Tensions between Tehran and Washington escalated to new highs in 2020. But with Joe Biden set to take office on the 20th of January, will the Iranian nuclear deal be salvaged by the upcoming administration? Or will Trump's sanction policy continue in Iran?
In 2015, Iran and 6 other world powers emerged out of months of negotiation. The result? A historic nuclear deal with Iran. Formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. For years, Iran's efforts to build a nuclear weapon bothered everyone. This deal came as a breather for the world.
It is a step away from the specter of conflict and towards the possibility of peace.
Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities, and in return, its crippling economic sanctions were lifted. All was well until this happened. US President Donald Trump felt that the deal did not go far enough. So, in May 2018, he decided to walk away from it. In November that year, he reinstated sanctions targeting Iran. The announcement drew criticism from around the world. A year after it was abandoned by the United States,
we would love to be able to negotiate a deal if they want to. If they don't want to, that's fine too.
Iran also suspended commitments under the 2015 international nuclear deal. Since then, tensions have escalated between the two countries. But the election of Joe Biden has changed the landscape. Biden was Obama's vice president when he signed the nuclear deal. And now he wants to return to it. Iran, on the other hand, could not be happier to see Donald Trump go.
Yes, we are very happy that this tyrant, this person who was not committed to anything, was toppled. We are very happy.
The country has been crippled by sanctions. Its economy is reeling and patience is running out. In December, a brazen attack on a nuclear scientist took Tehran by shock. One of Iran's most prominent nuclear scientists, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was traveling in a car when he was attacked. He later succumbed to his injuries on the way to the hospital. Fakhrizadeh's killing followed 2 other big security lapses. The theft of Iran's nuclear archive and a fire at a nuclear facility this year. Anger in Iran has prompted the passing of a bill, one that requires the government to suspend nuclear inspections unless sanctions are lifted. While Tehran is seeking revenge, any brazen action can derail relations with the United States. And no one knows it better than Iran's top leadership. While Biden's readiness to rejoin the nuclear deal brings some relief, Iran is walking a tight line here. Not only does it want an end to the sanctions, it wants compensation for the cost of Trump's sanctions. However, this may not come easy for the country. Either way, the United States' Tehran policy is looking at a major overhaul. And this may change everything in West Asia in 2021. West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
The pandemic has accelerated the shift away from oil. Several countries in West Asia are now struggling to balance their budgets, mainly because of their overdependence on oil revenues. Without reforms, several West Asia oil economies are now facing a difficult future.
The liquid gold that fueled West Asian economies. Wars have been fought over it. Regimes toppled and cities built in barren deserts. In geopolitics, West Asia meant one thing: a bloody struggle for oil. But after years of depending on it, West Asia is now planning to expand its economies, looking beyond the horizons of oil. While the shift away from oil was already underway, the pandemic has accelerated it further. COVID-19 has wiped out oil demand like never before. Global oil demand has reduced by a third. $270 billion in revenue. That is how much GCC countries are set to lose this year. Even the richest economies are struggling. Over the years, Gulf nations relied more on spending less and borrowing more during crisis. The 6-member Gulf Cooperation Council accounts for a fifth of the world's crude production. But as the outlook of oil remains uncertain, this strategy is riskier than ever before. While Brent prices have rebounded since an all-time low in April, they are not high enough for Gulf states to balance their budgets. Saudi Arabia is the largest producer of oil. An estimate indicates 70% of its budget comes from oil revenues. Currently, Saudi Arabia needs an oil price of over $76 a barrel. Oil is currently selling at less than $50 per barrel. For other countries, the impact has been greater. Debt levels are on the rise, and policies are favouring locals over migrant workers. A recent poll states that the countries are heading towards a steep contraction, before rebounding partially in 2021. But the crisis is here to stay. There is no indication of oil prices recovering. According to an International Monetary Fund forecast, West Asia's $2 trillion wealth could just vanish by 2034. That's just 14 years from now. This grim prediction spells doom for the region. The world is looking at alternative energy resources, and the West Asian economies need to catch up. And they should do it before their most prized asset turns into a liability. West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
It is impossible to talk about 2020 without mentioning COVID-19. Lockdowns, flight bans and quarantine measures have defined this year for everyone. It was no different in West Asia. Here's a look at how this pandemic impacted the region and how the future looks for all of us.
West Asia had many reasons to fear the coronavirus pandemic. Years of conflict has left countries reeling, and for many West Asia nations, it was a double whammy. When the virus first started spreading across the world, governments in West Asia did what the others were doing: lockdowns and social distancing measures. Flights were cancelled, borders were closed, and people were asked to stay at home. But that wasn't enough to stop the virus. Iran became one of the worst affected countries, and the death toll kept rising. While shutting down the economy was Iran's best option, years of crippling sanctions meant that it could just not afford it. Disparities in the region were far too vast, and cracks started emerging in the pandemic response. While on one hand, Israel has a world-class healthcare system, Gaza's medical system is on the verge of collapse. Years of war mean that Yemen and Syria were not equipped to deal with the pandemic. Lack of testing kits and displacement of refugees exacerbated this crisis, making it a ticking bomb for West Asia's conflict-ridden nations. Countries that depended on tourism were also struggling. Even the Hajj pilgrimage, which attracts thousands of pilgrims from around the world, was limited to only citizens inside the country. A nearly empty Mecca was a glaring reminder of the new normal. Even the countries that handled the crisis well saw themselves staring at a second or a third wave soon enough. Now, 12 months after the virus started spreading, the crisis has not been averted in West Asia.
The simplest solution is to close down all activities, but the next day, people would come out to protest the resulting chaos, hunger, hardship, and pressure.
However, vaccines have brought some relief to the region. Countries have started inoculating their population. Top leaders are now receiving the vaccine. While this has sparked a glimmer of hope, many fear that it could be years before some nations get their hands on a vaccine. Sanctions and lack of funds could make the vaccine inaccessible for many. A new mutant virus strain has also raised fears in the region. Countries are shutting down their borders once again and imposing national lockdowns to curb the surge. The new year does not look any different from the previous one. Even with the vaccine, social distancing and vigilance seem to be key to deal with the pandemic. West Asia Bureau, WION. World is One.
That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, bringing you more stories from the world's most volatile region. Until then, stay home and stay safe. Again, Happy New Year to all of our viewers. I am Ghadi Francis, and you are watching WION. World is One.